Ja, så vi tar en mann I mitten av I morgon som heter Richard Bauckham. Was it right? Bauckham. Okay, han kommer själv att säga det. Ja, vi sitter inne I hemma så en tjanon och sucha kalendern kvar han om det ena och utifrån tog så borde han haft ett konstant jetlag. Han I Hong Kong och Australien och Zeeland och Färjön och god ut kvar. Så vi är faktiskt nog så heldiga här han här I Färjön alltid. Men jag färdig att be Richard och Paul något namn för kom upp här. Paul för ha en liten samråd med Richard och han kommer ha en boskap till er. Så gör så väl tid. Yeah.
Well, Richard, I was thinking of maybe to start with, you could tell us a little bit about. We've just heard. You probably didn't understand it, but just heard that you travel a lot and you go from place to place to place. But
yes.
Where are you actually from, and who are you?
I'm originally from London. I grew up in North London, and then I was a student in Cambridge and started moving around at that point, and I'm now back in Cambridge.
Yeah, and one of the things I would like to ask you is, of course, not going into all your education, but more that your whole life, or all your working life, you have been doing theology in the university and in the church. Why? What are your motivation? Why? Why have you kept on doing this?
Yes, I do see it as a vocation. Mm-hmm. I think it's what I'm called by God to do. I think I have academic gifts which I can put into this kind of work. It's a mixture of things I've done, of course, because like most academics, I've taught undergraduates and postgraduates like yourself, and also written books. It's always been very important to me to write books, actually,
Yeah.
Which is not always the case for someone who teaches theology or any other subject. But I think from a very early age, I've always thought I was going to write books, before I knew they were going to be in theology, actually. But I've always tried to keep up my writing, even when other things were quite busy, because I've just seen that as an important element in what I'm called to do. And gradually I've found that some things I've written have proved very helpful and useful to people. So that sort of keeps me going.
That's good. And as you well, let's just move to that. In a little bit, you're going to preach from the Gospel of Mark on probably in the darkest hour of history of the suffering of Jesus on the cross and his abandonment on the cross, and the importance of that for us, for our lives, for our salvation, and for the hope that we get from it. So this morning you will talk about the central place of the cross in our life and faith as Christians. But then tomorrow night and on Tuesday night you'll have two different lectures that are going to broaden out as much as is possible our relationship to creation and our fellow creatures. Now, why is it important to think of nature and the environment and these issues for us as Christians?
Yes. I mean, I think I've always been concerned that Christians should understand the world we live in, the particular societies we live in, and to, as it were, relate to the world we live in from a Christian perspective. I think one of the things the Bible does is to open up a way of looking at the world so that we can see the world in the way that God, its creator, intended. And so I've always been concerned about relating Bible and theology to contemporary issues in which Christians can really play a role in different ways. And it does seem to me, that the ecological crises we're living through is a very urgent and demanding situation that we ought to be thinking about and thinking about how to live in such a context. And it seems to me that what can happen when we, as it were, look around the world and see what's going on, and it can send us back to look afresh at the Scriptures. And in this case, I think it sends us back to the doctrine of creation, to what it means to be creatures of God who share the earth with other creatures of God. I think we need to actually I think many Christians, have neglected the doctrine of creation or sort of taken it for granted. But I think it's important at this juncture of history that we go back to the Bible and to the Christian understanding of creation and see what that implies for us in the world today. And I think one of the things it implies for us is that God values all his creatures, and the rest of creation is not there just for us. It's there because God delights in it and values it, and have given us something of a special role to care for the rest of creation as our fellow creatures. So I think we have there are really strong roots in biblical teaching for caring about the rest of creation, and in the sort of situation we're in now, trying to do something about that. And of course, I'm sure you all know, there are kind of really quite small lifestyle changes that I think we're all called to do as a first step at any rate, to live without depleting the earth's resources to the extent that we have, and without polluting the atmosphere and all these things. I think these are things that as Christians we've got to take on board very seriously and think about them as issues that belong to our life with God, and see them in much the way that we think of other responsibilities and concerns that we have in life because we're Christians who are followers of Jesus Christ.
Good. I think we'll stop
do
here.
you want to just mention the two lectures?
Yeah, I will. I think I'll just do that in fair weeks, and
yes.
then I will.
Yeah.
Så jeg halte at det som jeg skal lykke nevne til at vi annet kveld vil en fyrles vi Richard Bauckham og i Milahusen som eiter først har vi givet noen navn Trygg Natura og Markfalda Løyve, men og det er om Bibelna og hva hun har å si om i akkurat støv som det i det, om hvordan vi firholder oss til akkurat som biodiversitet, eller at markfald i løvene, og hvordan vi virer alle skapende verset og i markfeldet der og virer til. Og så torskvalget klokken 8, tar vi en fyrlester ut i Varsjøtlen av lærerskolen, som heter vi det av giv for alt kvalitet hever skapende en framtid. Her er en fyrlester til Richard Bauckham nemlig her, hvordan vi husker om vågen, akkurat vågen eisen, tar vi husker om at vi vågner etter endamalen skaparens. Og tar vi eisen en framløve, her som PhD-rigeren kjør mer som var givet ut i bok i fjør, jeg har størst som ikke på skjort, men hun var eisen lagt fram til kvalitet. Så vi er anker toneliker, og det var mulig til å kjøpe anker boken og sånt. Så det her. Jeg halte vi for synes nu, og så at det her for jeg lykker å lese til brått i skriften som Richard kommer å ta seg ut fra, og så kommer han å ta seg til dere. Skriftbrottet Richard för att ta sig fra ur Markus 15 fra vers 22 till vers 23. Vi får läsa det nu, men när jag läser så fortäljer Lukas Heimon som inte skiljer för texten som är färdig att läsa. For you who cannot understand Faroese very well, of course it should be. Thanks. The passage that Richard will preach on, and which I will read now in Faroese, is Mark 15, verses 22 through verse 39. Markus 15, 22. Tar for så vi honom ut till steg Golgata, till skattlastav. Och tar gå vi honom vina dräcka vid myrra i, men han tog inte av. Så krossfästet han, och tar bort och klä i hansara och kasta av lot kvärt för skulle få. Tar 3 tøyman, tar krossfästet han. I skriften vid tøy som han var klä av 4 ljoa i så, konkur jödarna. 2 rånsmän krossfäst tar samman vid honom, annan högre mejen han och annan vinstre mejen. Tar Jack skriften ut som säger han var rocknaver mittlen ildgerar män. De som gynker fram vi spotta av han, riste vi hötten och sötte, 2 våre tär, 2 som bryter nyer temple och bygger det upp atter efter 3 döven, frälste självan och kom nyer av krossen. Alltså jag hatt hoa och hövudsprästarna hans och innan mittlen, och eisen i hinner skriftlärde och sötte. Annor har han frälst, så självan kan han inte frälsa. Kristus, kongur Israels, lät han nu komma ner av krossen så vi kunde sucha det och tryggva. Eisen tar som krossfäster var vi honom, hoa och han. Ta i satte tøymen var komen, leis myrskur iver allt landet, og ta varde lyka til 9. tøyman. Om 9. tøyman røpte Jesus vi herrar rød, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, til utlagt, God mun, kvui tu færen fra meg. Nekra av taimon og ståe her, søtt og taidar hørte til. Han råpar etter Elias. Men ein leip til fylte svamp vi etter og sette han har rørst der, gav hon at drekka og sige, boie, let oss suttja om Elias kommer at taka nyer. Men Jesus røpte vi herrar rødt og andaist. Ta skratna i forhengju i templen i 2, fra i erva lukka nyer i djøknon. Men ta i høvsmævren og i trastå, bant i av honom, sa at han andaist og hendahatt, sier han, sannliga, vær hese mævur, soner Guds.
Just before I preach, I did want to say how much I'm enjoying being here. What a pleasure it's to be here with you and in the Faroes, in spite of the weather of the last couple of days. But I'm enjoying it very much. One of the really nice things about having done quite a lot of teaching with doctoral students from various places is that I can go and visit them, and more than that, to catch up with them, to see how they are using and developing their gifts and their training. So it's been great to catch up with Paul and just hear a bit about how he's what he's doing nowadays and so on. So it's been a really good time. Thank you. Now, just before Jesus died, he summoned all his remaining strength to cry out loudly for all to hear these terrible words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? It is not how one would have expected a prophet, a holy man, still less a Messiah, to die. Jesus died abandoned by his God, the God he called Father, the God he had faithfully served up to this last moment of his life. If we think back over that whole passion narrative as Mark tells it, we can see how this final God-forsakenness of Jesus caps a crescendo of abandonment that characterizes the last hours of Jesus. Already at the Last Supper, Jesus knows that one of his disciples is about to betray him and the others are going to desert him. In Gethsemane, they do so. And even Peter, who had been so sure he would not desert Jesus, utterly dissociates himself from Jesus. Only the group of women disciples are faithful to the end, and they are obliged to watch him die only from a distance. The Jewish authorities reject Jesus. The crowd to whom Pilate offers to release Jesus disowns him, even though some of them had doubtless cheered his arrival in Jerusalem a few days before. But by the time the soldiers nail Jesus to the cross, the deepest dimension of Jesus' abandonment, the most terrible, his abandonment by God, is obvious for all to see. The onlookers throw it in his face, laughing at him. He saved others. He can't save himself. Let the Messiah come down from the cross. The subtext there is God has abandoned him. God has let this happen and is not intervening to save him. Then for 3 hours, darkness descends. The darkness of death, the darkness in which God leaves people to die. The onlookers fall silent. Jesus is left alone to know his abandonment by God. And when at the last he cries out to that absent God, protesting his abandonment, some of the bystanders mistake his words. He must be calling for Elijah to come to save him. The misunderstanding merely rubs the fact of Jesus' abandonment in. God does not send Elijah to rescue him. In the nick of time, Jesus dies. All this is so shocking, we may be tempted to alleviate it, to lift the darkness a little. Surely Jesus wasn't really abandoned by God. But we disbelieve Jesus' abandonment at our peril, because, strange as it may seem, the hope of the world and the hope of humanity are to be found in Jesus' abandonment by God. Mark's whole narrative of the crucifixion is directed to portraying Jesus' abandonment in the starkest possible way. It's the only aspect of the crucifixion that Mark emphasizes. It's not simply that Jesus, in the extreme of suffering, felt abandoned by God, as though that were an understandable mistake. The abandonment is a concrete reality. It's undeniable fact that God left Jesus to die. Yet there is another side to the matter, but one that we really only really understand if we do not play down the abandonment. Jesus knew full well what he was doing when he walked into the trap that resulted in his death. He knew that his death was God's will for him. To die, and to die that sort of death, was the culmination of Jesus' mission from his Father. He anguished over that in Gethsemane, where he had to accept the fact that God would not deliver him. And when he prayed that terrible prayer, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was not despairing. Perhaps he was on the brink of despair, but the words I was stepping back from that brink. For God is still, for Jesus, my God, even emphatically so, since he's chosen those words from a psalm that unusually repeat the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Even in his abandonment by God, Jesus continues to trust the God whose will he is doing. God has abandoned him, but he has not abandoned God. Something in this horror of the one who remains faithful to God in abandonment by God leads the centurion looking on to say, truly, this man was God's son. And through those words of the centurion, Mark the evangelist is telling us this is where we can most truly perceive that Jesus is the Son of his Father. This is where we can most fully perceive Jesus' deity. This is where we find God, even if, like the centurion, we hardly know anything else about God. How can that be? Well, suppose we ask, what's wrong with the world? What's wrong with humanity? What is it that God has to put right because we can't put it right ourselves? I think if you asked around people out there, your neighbours, your friends, people on the street, the most popular answer today, it seems to me, to that question, what's wrong with the world? What needs putting right? The most common answer, I think, is suffering. If we just look around the world, all the things we hear on the news, even very recently, good examples of it, or even if we focus in on our own experience with family or friends or our own lives, there is such massive suffering. And why does God allow suffering? Why do even the innocent, like little children, those who couldn't possibly in any sense deserve what they get, suffer so terribly? Why is there extreme poverty, AIDS and cancer, war and oppression, tsunamis and floods and hurricanes? Now, without trying to answer the question, what I want to do now is to point out that the deepest dimension of all suffering is abandonment. Bad enough to know that people have deserted you and left you to bear it all alone. Even worse, the sense that God has left you to suffer and die. People in all religions, and also people of no religion, instinctively almost cry out to God in the extremities of life. But so often God does not appear to hear. The suffering at the heart of all serious suffering is abandonment by God. Even if the suffering person concludes that there is no God, the absence of God is just as real. Now, when Mark tells us that the darkness descended on the dying Jesus for 3 hours, he says it was the darkness that covered the whole earth. We could translate it, I don't know whether the Ferry's translation had the whole land, but I think Mark meant more than the land. I think he meant us to think of the whole earth. When Jesus entered that darkness, his abandonment was no private misery. It was the darkness of suffering and death that covers everyone who suffers and dies in the absence of God. Jesus went there to be with them. He went there impelled by God's love to bring God's love to the unloved. His cross is God's own act of loving and suffering solidarity with all who suffer the absence of God. It does not tell us why there is so much suffering. It doesn't remove the suffering from the world, not yet at least, but it heals the suffering at the heart of all suffering, It heals the God-forsakenness. Let's go back to our question, what is it that's wrong with the world? What's wrong with humanity? What is it God must put right because we can't put it right ourselves? Another answer, less popular today, is human wickedness. Or, if not blatant wickedness, at least culpable failure to attend to those who suffer, to relieve or even remove suffering when that is possible. Behind much of the suffering lies human wickedness. And wickedness is endemic to human life. We know that if only we can set aside our addiction to delusion on this point. Quite ordinary people, made concentration camp guards, became not reluctant but sadistic in making other people suffer. That can happen to anyone. We all have that in us. Wickedness is a turning away from God. It's opting for the absence of God. And God's judgment on our human evil is very simply to leave us to the consequences of our turning away from him. He leaves us to suffer God's absence. And in the end, he leaves us to die. For without God, the natural consequence of human life is to perish. The Bible says that death is God's judgment on sin. And I think that's true in a very simple and obvious way. It's God's verdict on human life spoiled and ruined by our misuse of it. When we turn away from God, we turn human life into something that is fit only to perish. And God lets that happen. And yet God does not leave us. Jesus on the cross enters that God-forsakenness too. Jesus came to seek out the lost in all the dark places of human life, to bring God's love to them where they are. Whether their suffering, the absence of God, was innocent or culpable, whether they found themselves there incomprehensibly or took themselves there all too willingly, or whether, as for many, the two are muddled and inextricable. Jesus was there too. He put himself too under that terrible divine verdict on human life. His was the only human life for which that verdict had not a shred of justification. But nevertheless, Jesus shared it in order to reach us who must otherwise perish under it. The cross of Jesus is God's own act of loving and suffering solidarity with all who suffer the absence of God. I said that about innocent sufferers. It's equally true for those who have no one but themselves to blame for their God-forsakenness. And that's why we recognize God more truly in the cross than anywhere else. It's why we see what God's love really amounts to more clearly in the cross than anywhere else. Jesus' terrible abandonment by God makes us face up to the full extremity of the world's plight without God, and to see that God's salvific love can and does reach even there. Amen.
Yes, thank you, Richard, for bringing us back to that moment where it all happened. Ja, vi har nå hørt om hvordan ekstremt god elsker jeg oss, hva han ville gjøre for at vi skulle kunne kjøpe oss leis. Sannolikt gav han allt upp för jag skulle vara frälst. Jag är ofta också jag till att Jesus han lei så sannolikt. Men hvis vi fyrer stille om kvalt hva god ferien for røkkenen, hvis vi også når jeg selv var pappa, så en av synden som skulle ferien røkkenen rævla på inner og tortureres hver så ofte verre i hele han. Det ikke vita, men alle goddomrene her, han leif i okkar skilt. Vi får at jeg synes jeg noen sanger. Hvis det noe som over okkar hjärsta og gjerne vil være byen 4, det kan være hva som helst, så det velkommen at komme fram her. Noen folk fra Stanta som kunne prata med tikon og be for tikon. Stronker som manglar det her, at gjøre oss ut til han god som kallar av oss. Så er det velkommen å gjøre det nå. Så vi får at jeg synes jeg noen sanger. Annars møte som så liot. Jeg skal lykke å si at Arne Færa til at nå 1. september